For 18 years, Jesus disappears. Not from faith, not from memory, but from the historical record. Completely gone. This is the most written about, most studied, most debated human being in the history of civilization. Billions of people across the planet have built their entire lives around his teachings, and yet there is an 18-year hole in his story. We know he was 12 years old when he appeared at the temple in Jerusalem. He sat among the scholars, asking questions, giving answers. The teachers were astonished at his understanding. 12 years old. Then, silence. The next time any gospel mentions him, he is 30, walking out of the Jordan River after his baptism, ready to begin his public ministry. 18 years. No school, no teacher, no journey, no record. Now ask yourself, does that make sense? Think about the greatest spiritual teachers, philosophers, leaders in human history. Were any of them simply born ready? Did any of them just appear, fully formed, with no years of learning behind them? Of course not. So how do we explain a man who, at 30 years old, walked into Galilee already speaking with a depth and authority that shocked even the most educated religious experts of his time? Teachers like that are not born in a single moment. They are shaped, they are formed by something and somewhere. So here is the question historians and independent researchers have been asking for generations. Where was Jesus during those 18 years? And here is where this story takes a turn that most people never expect. Because the answer that some researchers point to is not in Rome, not in Greece, not in Babylon. It is in Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, the ancient Nile Valley. When you start tracing the connections, the historical connections, the cultural connections, the philosophical connections, something remarkable begins to come into focus. This is not a religious debate. This is a historical investigation. And by the end of this video, you may see the story differently than you ever have before. Let us start with what is missing. Open any of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and search for any detail about Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30. You will not find them. The Gospel writers were not writing biographies in the modern sense. They were writing theological documents focused on the message, the ministry, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. The early life of Jesus was not their primary concern. Luke is the most specific of the 4, and even he gives us almost nothing. After the temple scene at age 12, he writes, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man." That's it. One sentence. 18 years summarized in one sentence.
Now think about this carefully. Every great rabbi in Jesus' era went through years of intense, structured study under recognized masters. You followed, you learned, you absorbed, and only then did you begin to teach. So who was Jesus' master? Where did he study? The Gospels are silent, and that silence is unusual. In the Jewish tradition of that time, a teacher's lineage mattered enormously. When religious leaders challenged Jesus publicly, they asked, "By what authority do you do these things?" And Jesus never gives them a straightforward answer. Could it be that his formation happened somewhere outside the recognized system, somewhere the religious establishment of his day would not have accepted? There is something else worth knowing. The Bible we read today was not assembled overnight. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD made critical decisions about which texts were canonical and which were not. But other documents circulated in early Christian communities: the Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of James, the Gospel of Philip, documents that painted a broader, more complex picture. Many were not included in the final canon. The silence in the Bible on those 18 years may not reflect an absence of history. It may reflect a choice about which history to preserve. So if the official record is silent, where else can we look? Here is something that rarely gets taught in mainstream Western history classrooms. At the time Jesus was alive, Africa was not a distant peripheral part of the ancient world. Africa was a center, a hub, a place where some of the most advanced civilizations on Earth had been operating for thousands of years. Let us be specific, because this is not a general claim. This is history. Start with Egypt. By the 1st century AD, Alexandria had already been the intellectual capital of the known world for nearly 300 years. The Library of Alexandria was not just a building full of scrolls, it was a living institution, a gathering place for the greatest mathematicians, physicians, philosophers, and spiritual thinkers from across the Mediterranean. Scholars came from Greece, from Persia, from the Jewish diaspora, from Rome. They came because Alexandria was where knowledge lived. But Egypt had something even older. The Egyptian mystery traditions, systems of spiritual knowledge that had existed for thousands of years, were still fully active during the time of Jesus. These were not primitive belief systems. They were sophisticated frameworks addressing the nature of the soul, moral accountability, inner transformation, and the relationship between the human and the divine. Pythagoras and Plato had both reportedly traveled to Egypt to study under Egyptian priests. These are documented connections between Egyptian knowledge and Greek philosophy. So here is a question worth sitting with. If the greatest Greek philosophers made that journey specifically to deepen their understanding, why would we assume that someone like Jesus, who demonstrated extraordinary spiritual depth, would not have been drawn to the same source? Now move further south, to Ethiopia. Ethiopia had a connection to Judaism that was ancient and documented long before the 1st century. The story of the Queen of Sheba, recorded in both the Hebrew Bible and the Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Nagast, describes a direct cultural and spiritual link between Ethiopia and the Israelite kingdom of Solomon. By the time of Jesus, Ethiopia had established Jewish communities and active trade routes connecting it to Egypt and the broader Mediterranean world. It was not isolated, it was connected. And then there is Nubia, the civilization along the Nile between Egypt and Sudan, a crossroads where African, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean cultures intersected for thousands of years. Jewish communities in Egypt are archaeologically documented. The Elephantine settlement in southern Egypt predates Jesus by 500 years. The movement between Judea and Africa was regular, normal, even expected. So when we ask whether Jesus could have spent time in Africa, we are not asking whether such a journey was possible. We are asking something more specific. If someone was genuinely seeking the deepest available spiritual knowledge in the 1st century, where would they go? Africa was not distant. Africa was essential, and there is one place that stands out more than any other. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus spent time in Egypt as a child. Joseph and Mary fled there with the infant Jesus to escape King Herod. That is a fact within the Gospel record. Jesus was in Egypt. Now here is the question most people never ask. What if he returned? Not as a refugee, not as a child, but as a young man deliberately seeking knowledge from one of the most ancient spiritual traditions in the world. The parallels between Egyptian thought and Jesus' teachings are striking. Egyptian religious tradition placed enormous emphasis on moral accountability after death, the idea that what a person does in this life determines what happens in the next. Jesus taught the same principle. Egyptian priests emphasized inner purity over outward ritual, that true spiritual transformation happens inside the person, not through external performance. Jesus made this same distinction repeatedly, criticizing the Pharisees for following the law outwardly while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness. We are not claiming that Jesus simply copied Egyptian theology. That would be an oversimplification. Cultures influence each other. Ideas travel. What we are observing is a pattern of convergence, a set of philosophical emphases that appear in Egyptian traditions long before the 1st century, and then appear again with striking similarity in the teachings of Jesus. The question is not whether this proves anything. The question is whether it is worth taking seriously.
And here is the piece that most people never learn about. The Egyptian mystery schools were not public institutions. They did not operate like a university where anyone could walk in and attend lectures. They were initiatory systems, meaning that knowledge was transmitted progressively. You had to earn entry. You had to demonstrate readiness. And the deeper teachings were reserved for those who had proven themselves through years of preparation. This is a critical point, because it means that if someone was genuinely seeking the deepest knowledge that Egypt had to offer, they would need time, significant time. Not weeks, not months, years. 18 years is exactly the kind of framework that would allow for a full initiation into such a system. We are not saying this is what happened. We are saying this is the kind of framework that could explain something that otherwise has no explanation. How does a man from a small town in Galilee, with no documented formal education, suddenly appear at 30 years old, speaking with the depth of someone who has spent a lifetime in deep study? Egypt offers one possible piece of that answer, but Egypt might not be the only place holding pieces of this story. If Egypt is the well-known chapter of Africa's ancient spiritual history, then Ethiopia is the chapter most people in the Western world have never read. The kingdom of Aksum, rising to regional power during the 1st century AD, was a sophisticated empire with its own written language, coinage, and deep engagement with ancient spiritual traditions. The Beta Israel, the Jewish community of Ethiopia, maintained practices that scholars believe may reflect very early forms of Hebrew religious life, preserving elements lost or transformed elsewhere.
Historical traditions from the region describe traveling holy teachers and spiritual seekers who moved between the great ancient civilizations of Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia. These accounts are not part of the biblical canon, but they exist and have been studied by historians. They point to a pattern of movement and exchange that was simply normal in the ancient world. Certain themes consistent in Ethiopian spiritual tradition, compassion as a central value, the equality of all people before the divine, inner transformation over outward religious performance, bear a striking resemblance to the core of what Jesus taught. We are not claiming similarity proves direct contact, but here is the question researchers keep returning to. Why do these particular emphases appear in an African tradition geographically remote from Judea at roughly the same historical moment that Jesus is teaching them? Is it coincidence, parallel development, or evidence of something moving between these worlds that we have not fully traced? We are not claiming to have the answer, but we are asking whether it is reasonable to consider the question. And that question leads us somewhere uncomfortable. If Africa played a genuine role in the formation of early Christian thought, why has that never been part of the mainstream story? Early Christianity was not a single unified movement from the beginning. In the first 2 centuries after Jesus, there were multiple streams, communities in Alexandria, in Ethiopia, in Syria, in Rome. When Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, the church in Rome became the dominant institution, and the tradition Rome endorsed became the mainstream version that spread across Europe and later much of the world. The African traditions, the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, did not disappear. They survived. They are still alive today, but they were gradually pushed to the margins of the mainstream conversation. When you control which version of a story gets told, you also influence which version of history gets remembered. Africa was present in the earliest history of Christianity, deeply present, but that presence was gradually minimized in the dominant story. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is simply what happens when history is written from a particular vantage point. The Ethiopian Church preserves texts and traditions the Western Church does not include in its canon. The Coptic Church maintains a continuity with the earliest centuries of Christian practice that predates the Council of Nicaea by hundreds of years. History is not just about what happened, it is about what was preserved, and what was preserved depends in part on who was doing the preserving. If something was left out, it changes how we see everything that came after.
Now let us look at the teachings themselves. Three themes run consistently through the words of Jesus: forgiveness, equality, and inner transformation. Forgiving those who wrong you, not just once, but repeatedly, was not a common emphasis in the mainstream Jewish tradition or Greek philosophy of the first century. But in Egyptian moral philosophy, restoring harmony through forgiveness was a recognized value. The idea that all people, regardless of status, gender, or wealth, have equal standing before the divine was radical in the Roman world. But in Ethiopian tradition and certain Egyptian philosophical schools, this concept had roots going back centuries. And the emphasis on changing the inner person rather than performing external ritual was central to Egyptian mystery school teaching for thousands of years. Are these similarities proof of direct influence? No, but ideas do not appear randomly. Every great teacher is, to some degree, a synthesizer, someone who shapes what they absorbed during formation into something that speaks to their moment in history. If Jesus encountered these African traditions firsthand during those 18 missing years, then these parallels are not coincidences, they are footprints.
Not everyone accepts this interpretation, and it is important to be honest about that. Mainstream biblical scholars, both those who approach the text from a religious perspective and those who approach it purely historically, generally require direct documentary evidence before accepting historical claims. And when it comes to Jesus spending significant time in Africa during those 18 years, that direct evidence does not exist. No letter, no travel record, no account from someone who met him there. That is a legitimate challenge, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But here's the counterpoint researchers consistently raise. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We lack direct documentary evidence for enormous portions of ancient history. We reconstruct the past from fragments, indirect evidence, cultural parallels, archaeological context, the pattern of ideas. And when it comes to those 18 years, we have no direct evidence for any explanation at all. Not for the theory that he stayed in Galilee, not for any other theory. We simply do not know. So the question becomes, when evaluating a historical mystery, how do we decide which possibilities are worth taking seriously? Is it purely about direct proof, or also about how well an explanation fits what we do know about the ancient world? That is a question historians genuinely disagree about, and every tradition has reasons, sometimes historical, sometimes institutional, to prefer certain answers over others. The biggest clues in history are not always the ones that get the most attention, because sometimes the questions we avoid are the most revealing ones of all. Let us bring this back to where we started. 18 years, gone from the record. A man appears at 30, speaking with a depth and clarity that suggests a lifetime of serious engagement with profound questions. Where did that come from? We have explored the real Africa of the first century, Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of learning in human history, Ethiopia with its ancient and continuous connection to the Jewish world, Nubia, a crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years. We have looked at the philosophical parallels between what Jesus taught and what these African traditions had been teaching for centuries. And we have asked the honest question, if someone in the first century was seeking the deepest available spiritual knowledge, could Africa have been part of that journey? The answer, based purely on historical context, is yes, it could have been. We are not claiming it was. The evidence does not allow for certainty. But here's a thought worth sitting with. Maybe the story was never lost. Maybe it was simply told from one angle, one region, one institutional perspective. And if we are willing to look at the full picture, at Africa's documented role in the ancient world and the early African roots of Christian practice, what emerges is something larger and more complex than the version most of us were taught. Christianity, in its deepest historical roots, may have connections to Africa that go far beyond what the mainstream conversation has acknowledged. History is never just one story. It is always many stories at once. And sometimes the most important ones are the ones we are only beginning to tell. So I want to ask you directly, do you think Jesus ever set foot in Africa?
not as a theological statement, not as a claim of faith, but as a historical possibility, based on what we know about the ancient world, the movement of ideas, and the connections between Judea and Africa in the 1st century. Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you disagree with anything we explored today, say that too. This is exactly the kind of conversation that history deserves, and that kind of debate in the comments helps everyone think more clearly about these questions. If this video made you think, made you question, made you want to dig deeper, then hit subscribe, because this is part of a larger series. In the next video, we're going back even further. We're going to look at the African roots of early Christianity before Rome took control, before the councils, before the canon, when Christian communities in Egypt and Ethiopia were already centuries old, preserving traditions, texts, and practices that most of the Western world has never encountered. That story is one most people have never heard, and it might be the most important piece of this puzzle. I'll see you there.